Θα ήθελα να προσκαλέσω τον κύριο Ρόμπερτ Hayes, ο οποίος είναι μηχανολόγος μηχανικός. Τον ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που ήρθε από την Αγγλία εδώ. Είναι εκπαιδευτικός και σύμβουλος στην εταιρεία Cold Chain Consultants Limited.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. And thank you for Mediline for inviting me along, and thank you for your attendance to come to hear me speak today. There'll be a short delay while we find the file. That's the one. Let me do that. Just want to get it on the slideshow. There you go. We're there. Good. I want to talk a little bit about distribution. I want to talk a little bit about the European rules and regulations and focus in on two particular areas: quality and transport. Distribution, of course, of the medicinal product is a key step in the supply chain. It's the closest that we get to the end user, the patient, the person who's taking the product because they have some illness they're trying to cure. The thing about distribution is that there's nothing that a distribution player can do to improve the quality of the product. The manufacturer will have put a lot of effort and expense and resource into making a high quality product, and there's nothing that can happen in the distribution chain that can make that product better. But there are plenty of opportunities to do damage. And clearly one of the major opportunities with pharmaceutical products is temperature excursions. It's useful to know also that the rules that govern good distribution practice are very similar to the rules that govern good manufacturing practice. And in fact, organisations like WHO and the British MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, are now tending to use the phrase GMDP. They see it as a continuous process, such that it's seamless. It doesn't have a gap between the manufacturing and the distribution. The other thing about GDP, and GMP for that fact, is that it's not rocket science. It's not difficult. It's basic common sense. And you know what they say about common sense? In many cases it's not very common. But if you look at your operations and you see things that actually don't make sense, they're probably not very compliant either. So do look at what you do, look at your processes and say to yourself, is this sensible? The European Union directives and guidance go back quite a long time. Starts in March 1992, and the most recent one is the Falsified Medicines Directive. There are various directives and amendments within that time period, and the most recent document of real importance is the EU Guidance on Good Distribution Practice, which was published 7th of March 2013 and implemented in September this year. I would point out that there were two mistakes in that document which are being rectified with a reissue of the document, version 2, which I believe is now available on the European Commission website. But this is a pan-European directive, and it is open to a certain amount of local interpretation and additional guidance. And I draw your attention to a couple of websites that I'm familiar with, both the Irish Medicines Board and the British MHRA, who have published various supportive documents which help you to understand and implement the rules and regulations. The last one on the list is probably of the most interest to you if you're about to set up a quality system, because it's a relatively comprehensive, although not complete, list of SOPs that you can use as the basis for developing your quality system. So that last reference, and it's a free download, it's Word documents which you can then edit for your own use. And it comes from the regulator, so it's of good quality. The guidance is in 10 chapters. As I say, I want to look at two in particular, Chapter 1, Quality, and Chapter 9, Transport. But first of all, I'd like to just say a few words about quality as a cost. Because quality is an expensive process. We need to maintain the quality of the product. We need to ensure that the patient taking that product is safe from any damage that might have occurred either during manufacturing or during distribution. So we have to do lots of things to make sure that the quality is maintained. When we talk about cost of quality, we should really talk about cost of poor quality. We should talk about the cost of things going wrong. For example, having to rework the manufactured item, to have to retest a product, rebuilding or repairing a machine, correcting mistakes in documents and records. And they're very, very common. And I couldn't help but notice there's a mistake in the programme. Did anybody spot it? It's my name. They've missed the T off the end. Never mind. It's not a critical document, and I'm not going to complain too much, but it is there. It's easy to do. And reworking a service, such as replacing an erroneous order or a damaged order, dealing with a customer complaint, perhaps dealing with regulatory action, maybe even dealing with a product recall. So any cost that would not have been expended if quality were perfect contributes to the cost of quality. Now, this isn't a new concept. A guy called Armand Feigenbaum, I think that's how you pronounce it, he's not here, so I don't need to worry too much, defined 4 cost categories in a publication produced in 1956 in the Harvard Business Review. And he talked about prevention costs, the costs that are incurred to design systems that are robust, reliable, and can deliver good results every time you run them. The things you do before you start to run your operation, they're proactive. This is quality assurance rather than quality control. But then we have appraisal costs. This will be inspection and testing, checking. This is very much QC. QC, we can demonstrate with experiments, is actually very ineffective. If you have a large population and you have a few failures, you can't find those very easily by sampling. In fact, in many cases, it's almost impossible. And the little trick I play when I'm running training courses is to shuffle a joker into a pack of cards, then pass the cards around the room and ask everybody to take a card and see if they can find the joker. Well, that represents about a 2% failure and a 2% sampling rate with each person. And it will usually go through half the pack before anybody finds it. Then we have internal failure costs. This is where a failure has occurred, but it's been identified within the organisation before it's left to go to the customer. You end up with scrap, you end up with rework, you end up with delays, you end up with having to redo work to satisfy the customer demand, but it hasn't actually reached the customer. The customer hasn't complained. The worst sort of failure is external failure. This is where the failure has been identified by the customer. So a delivery has been made and the customer has realised that there's been a temperature excursion. They have then got on the phone to you and said, we're unhappy with the service you've given us. You have supplied us product that is not up to the standard we expect. We're going to return it. We're going to expect you to compensate us, and maybe we're not going to buy from you anymore. So that's the worst sort of failure. The numbers to think about, and this is relevant for pretty much any industry, be it manufacturing, distribution, pharmaceuticals, general engineering, aerospace, is that cost of quality is somewhere around 25% of your sales cost, your sales value. And that was identified in an article written by Roger Olson. Philip Crosby, one of the great quality gurus, said it's going to be somewhere between 15 and 30%. It's the same area. And Joseph Duran, another quality guru, said somewhere in the range 20 to 30%. So realistically, you're looking at a number that's going to come out somewhere between 20 and 30% of your sales value will be your cost of quality in total. Now, what you need to do in managing that cost is to avoid external failure, because that's very expensive and very damaging. You need to reduce your internal failure to 0, and your target should be 0, because if you have a target that's more than 0, it's like saying, well, it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to make errors, and it's not, especially when you're dealing with medicinal products. We don't want to do too much inspection because it's not effective. We want to do inspection for the purpose of verification, not to find out what has happened. And I draw the analogy with the journey here from Heathrow in London. The pilot came on and said it's going to take us 3 hours and 20 minutes to fly to Athens. He said we should be on the stand at 7 o'clock in the evening. Pretty much you could set your watch by it. What wouldn't have been good is if the pilot had said, after about 3 hours flying, wonder where we are. Would somebody look out the window and see if they see anything familiar? And if you do, can you tell me? That's not good news. So we want quality assurance. We want to make sure that the effort has been put in to processes and systems that determine the quality before we start to carry out the activity. Quality assurance. We should be aiming for aerospace levels of reliability, 6 Sigma and beyond. And I often ask the question, if your process, whatever it is, manufacturing, distribution, if your process was an aircraft, would you be prepared to get on it? The quality system. This is getting back to the European rules. Wholesalers must maintain a quality system setting out responsibilities, processes and risk management principles in relation to their activities. And in section 1.5 it talks about quality risk management as a systematic process for assessing, controlling, communicating and reviewing risks to the quality of the medicinal product. Now, the use of risk management is being promoted very hard by the regulators, both in the European Union and in the other regulatory authorities around the world. It was first introduced as a concept by the FDA in 2002. Most of the regulators now have lined up behind a document called ICHQ9. ICH.org is the website, and if you go to that website you can download ICHQ9 risk management. And you'll find it's exactly the same wording used by the FDA and the European Union and the Australians. And they break it up into 3 sections. They say first we have to assess the risk. We have to understand what it is, where it is, how big it is, how often it occurs, and how it might affect the patient if it reached them. The next thing we need to do is to control the risk. So we put in systems, measures to try to eliminate the risk if we can. If we can't eliminate it, then we try to reduce the risk to a level that's considered acceptable. And then we review the risk. We monitor it continuously and we review our decision-making process about that risk when we do our annual product review or some other appropriate time. There are various tools and techniques. The one that's proven most popular in the pharmaceutical industry is failure mode effect analysis. This is a technique that was developed by the US military for the development of rocket science, the space race, and it's used very, very widely in general manufacturing, and it seems to be the most popular one with medicinal products manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies. And it's a simple process. It says what can go wrong, what are the consequences, and how can we measure these in terms of severity, probability, and detectability? How easy can we detect them? And then we put in the necessary measures, hopefully to increase prevention, because if we can prevent the risk, it's no longer a problem. But if we can't prevent the risk, maybe we can put some sort of detection system in. We require some focused reviews on processes and procedures, and we need to train and educate our personnel in the use of risk management methodologies. As I said, the pharmaceutical industry favours FMEA, but there's no mandated requirement. You can use any risk assessment, risk management process. The only thing that is mandated is that you do something, that you don't ignore it. And with processes, the better you understand the process, the better you can control the risk. So if you have poor process understanding, up here, then you're presenting a very high risk to the product, and a high risk to the product is a high risk to the patient, and a high risk to the patient will get the attention of the regulator. If you have good process understanding, you're down in this area where you can manage your risks very effectively and patient safety is assured. Outsourced activities. These are things that we ask another company to do on our behalf. Again, the regulations require a risk-based approach. So if you're contracting your distribution to a carrier, then you must carry out a risk assessment to make sure that their processes and procedures, their quality system, their personnel, their hardware is all capable of doing the task that you want. If you're buying packaging materials, that sort of thing that these guys sell, you must go through appropriate risk assessment to ensure that the product that you're putting in those packs for that journey is going to survive the journey without any damage occurring through temperature excursions. and the onus is always on the contract giver. The responsibility ultimately ends with the pharmaceutical manufacturer who has their name on the box. It's their product license, their ultimate responsibility. Clearly, wholesale distributors have a licensing process which is regulated, and they also have to comply. And in both cases, if they get it wrong, then regulatory action can follow. The Falsified Medicines Directive was introduced a year or so back because of the increasing risk of falsified medicinal products. But again, it talks about quality systems, risk-based approach, making sure that what you do doesn't involve a risk to the patient. This is quite a big topic. I could talk about it for a couple of hours if you had the time, but we don't, unfortunately. But there are different aspects and controls coming into place, such as serialization of packs, such that each pack has a unique number on it, a unique code. But products are temperature sensitive, and we're here today to talk in the main about temperature control, temperature sensitivity. And these are just boxes of pharmaceutical products that I scanned. You may notice that on one of them there's actually a bit of a mistake in terms of what they've said. Can anybody spot it? Anybody got the mistake? Look at this. Store at 25 degrees Celsius. That's not realistic, is it? It should be store at a temperature no higher than 25 degrees Celsius. So transport. The regulatory view is that transport is simply storage that moves. So any requirement for the product that's required in storage must also be applied to transport. So where it says do not store above 30, do not store above 25, do not freeze, then that must be applied to the transport routes as well. So equipment should be qualified. Vehicles, if you're using temperature-controlled vehicles, should be properly mapped. Packaging should be validated. Journeys should be monitored. And staff should be trained. And that includes the drivers. The requirements are simple. You must maintain storage conditions in transport. It says so in the guidance. And that guidance is underwritten by European law. If you listen to the regulators, our regulator in the UK, the MHRA, have made it very clear medicines are to be shipped within label conditions. The Canadians have a similar view. Drugs should be stored according to label requirements as the minimum default. So the use of stability data to justify poor transport practices is not allowed, and the regulators generally take a very dim view of mean kinetic temperature. And talking to one of our regulators, he said, when companies start to talk about MKT, it's an indication to me that they haven't got control of their process. They haven't done the necessary risk management, they haven't understood what they do. So having good process understanding is the key to success in this business. Temperature excursions are very common. This is information from a couple of years ago from the MHRA that 51% of inspections demonstrated deficiencies with temperature control and monitoring. And this is inspection of fixed facilities. This is warehouses. This isn't transport. I suspect if the analysis was done on transport, that number would be higher. And an industry survey showed that 30% of individuals reported temperature excursions in 6% or more of their temperature-sensitive products. So the regulators know it happens. Industry know it happens. We need to do something about it. As somebody who takes medicinal products from time to time, I want to be sure that that product is safe. And I'm sure you're the same. So, there are different ways of achieving temperature control and managing temperature control through distribution. One way, of course, is to have a temperature-controlled vehicle, such as this thing by Polar Speed. It's a temperature-controlled vehicle. It's got a refrigeration unit on it. It's fully insulated. It's fully instrumented. They've mapped the inside of the vehicle, and they can give you absolute certainty that it will reach the other end of the journey without the vehicle having gone outside the range that you specified. They're best suited for shorter journeys. This is a van. It doesn't fly. So this company, Polar Speed, tend to work exclusively in the UK. There are some bigger companies. You'll have come across World Courier, I'm sure. They have a good reputation and they're extraordinarily expensive. There are others. There's IJS Global in the Netherlands. and others. There will be local suppliers. It costs, but the risk is low. You can't get them in all markets. Another way you can do it is an active container system, such as the Envirotainer. These have a controlled environment within the container. Often it's driven by CO2. Often it has a battery pack to circulate the cold air and the CO2 around the container. But they do have their disadvantages. Some airlines won't take them because of the discharge of CO2 into the hold. So you have limitations on the number you can put in the aircraft. The other thing with the Envirotainer is that it is rented. So you send it out full of product and you're still paying the rental until you can get it back to base. And what tends to happen is that airlines don't like shipping empty containers when they've got full containers for something else. So the empty Envirotainer tends to sit at the destination airport waiting for a plane that's not fully loaded. The rental costs are relatively high, but they're successful. They do the job. The other way of doing it, of course, is to have an insulated packaging solution, where you have some sort of insulated box. You probably have some sort of medium within. It might be a simple ice pack. It might be a phase change material. But it's very important to specify these things properly. If you do, they will maintain temperature control through a range of external temperatures through the duration of the journey. They're not recommended where you don't have a good understanding of what the journey is going to be. You need to have that knowledge of the process. The slide I showed earlier, good process knowledge reduces the risk. If you have poor knowledge about the process, the journey, in terms of times, temperatures and the like, then it's very difficult then to go back and specify a box to suit. You may underspecify, you may overspecify. What you really need to do is get it right. How about this? An off-the-shelf shipper. This is being marketed. What do you think? They're saying it's a simulated winter product, so liquid product during a winter cycle, maximum load, and it's going to maintain temperature between 22 degrees up here and -10. Let's have a show of hands. Who would buy that? Would you buy that? Nobody's hand's going up. Well, let's look at what's wrong. They've started at a high temperature. The temperature of the product has started to climb slightly. So they've dropped the external temperature to bring the product temperature down. When the product temperature has started to fall, they brought the external temperature back up to move the product temperature back up a little bit. And as soon as it starts to climb, we come back down again. So they're carefully manipulating the external temperature to maintain that internal temperature. And frankly, I could validate a paper bag to do that with the right conditions. So be very, very careful of people selling you off-the-shelf solutions that, in this case, are clearly false. I've hidden the supplier's name. Regulatory inspections. If you have a license as a wholesale dealer, as a manufacturer, you will have an inspection process, and your regulator will come to see you on a predetermined basis. Or maybe they will turn up unannounced. And they will classify the observations into terms of critical, where severe non-compliance and patient harm, major or other. This is MHRA's classification. Other regulators will take a similar approach. If there's a serious deficiency in your quality system, if you are presenting risks to the patient, then your license as a wholesale dealer may be revoked or suspended. The responsible person within your organisation may be withdrawn from the licence, and the responsible person may even be blacklisted by the regulator such that they won't be able to work in that role again. And in most European states, the responsible person can be liable under civil law for breaches of the licence, as well as the company losing their licence and having action taken against them. So the responsible person is very responsible. I know that Pavlos is going to talk about the RP a little later. So that's my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'd be pleased to field them.
Εάν έχετε κάποιες ερωτήσεις, είναι έτσι η δομή της σημερινής μας συνάντησης, που μπορείτε να τις θέτετε στο τέλος της ομιλίας καθενός ομιλητή.
We have one in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Gregory Laskaris. So,
Good morning.
a question. You have all these new processes, these new regulations of the European Union.
Sorry, I can't hear you from here.
Okay, now
That's
it's
better,
better?
yeah.
Okay. These new regulations of the European Union, have they been tested as far as their cost effectiveness is concerned?
Cost effectiveness of the
Do they end up in some really hard clinical endpoint to make it better?
Well,
Are they effective as far as it concerns the final consumer? Have they been tested in quality of life, gain for the end user?
No, it's more of a risk-based approach the regulators have taken in putting the regulations together. They've looked at the events that have occurred previously and determined through their inspection processes, and bearing in mind it's the regulators from all of the European member states, so there's a lot of data available to them, and they've looked at the failures that have occurred and said, what regulation do we need to put into place to make sure this failure can't occur again, and also what failure might occur that perhaps we haven't thought about before. So they've done it very much, I think, on a risk-based approach based on a huge amount of knowledge from the regulatory process. How we measure that at patient level, that's always a problem, because when people take drugs, they're ill.
Concerning to the cost, okay, how much do we pay to save one more life, for instance?
I don't think that's ever been done, because I think it's an impossible thing to measure.
Everything's possible.
Well, it is, yeah, but the difficulty is that people who take drugs are ill. And when somebody taking drugs dies, what do they look at? The doctor doesn't want to blame himself. How many times do we actually know that it's a temperature excursion that's caused a problem? And I think there are many cases where that could be a contributory factor. Where vaccines perhaps have been frozen and thawed and have been deactivated, and people have been vaccinated and the vaccine's been unsuccessful. A colleague of mine in Australia, one of his friends was taken into hospital seriously ill. He was administered with a drug. It had no effect. And the reason it had no effect was that the drug had been through a temperature excursion. The doctor then said, we need to increase the dose. The next dose that was given was a different batch which hadn't gone through the temperature excursion, and they gave him an overdose. And he nearly died. He was in intensive care for a week because of this overdose. How many of those have occurred that we've never spotted the fact it's temperature? We don't know. Yeah, I agree everything is measurable, but you've got to follow the audit trail, if you will, to determine what it is. But certainly as a consumer, I'm quite pleased to see the strengthened regulation. Any other questions? Yep, behind you here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Panagiotis Gatsios, and I'm from TNT Global Courier. We know that the GTP is a guidance for the time. Do we take this period as a preparation period? And any ideas how long that will take until it become a law?
No, the guidance is underwritten by European directives. So what they've done is interpreted the European directives in a guidance document. And you'll find that the regulatory approach is that the guidance is effectively the law. And if you fail to meet any of the guidance, they'll find a clause in the legislation that refers to it. I'm not sure how things are in Greece, but in the UK we have a thing called the Highway Code. And the Highway Code tells us how to drive on the roads. In itself it's not law, but it's underwritten by various legislation. And this is very much the same. It's a European guidance document underwritten by European legislation. So take it as it's where it says should, read must.
Thank you.
Any more? I think perhaps not. Well, look, I'm here for the day, so if you think of anything later on, please come and find me, and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε τον κύριο Hayes.